The Eastern Fringe had always been a place of unease, a region of stars stretching into the void where Imperial maps thinned and the light of the Astronomicon flickered like a dying ember. But now, something far worse stirred there. It began quietly, like a whisper carried through the cold vacuum of space. A faint, broken signal drifted from the fringe, its tone distorted, its meaning unclear. Imperial listening posts classified it as unknown xenopattern. Others called it a simple communication malfunction. But the tech priests who analyzed the raw audio heard something that chilled even their steel-coated hearts. The sound was organic, living, feeding. Within days, more signals followed, each one weaker, as if choked mid-transmission. The Adeptus Mechanicus attempted to boost long-range arrays, but every attempt returned only the same disturbing result, a resonance pattern shaped like a pulse, almost like the heartbeat of some colossal creature lurking between the stars. Then came the Astropaths, across multiple sectors. Imperial Astropaths tried to reach out to the Fringe to confirm what was happening, to re-establish psychic contact with the outposts that had begun to fall silent. But every attempt ended the same way. Mid-message, the Astropath would suddenly scream, eyes rolling back, blood pouring from nose and ears before collapsing lifelessly to the floor. Their final fragmented words were always the same: "It is hungry." Panic spread through the Adeptus Astrotelepathica. Psychers trained to withstand horrors of the warp were being killed instantly, snuffed out like candles in a storm. The phenomenon was given a name whispered only behind locked doors. One by one, Imperial outposts on the Eastern Fringe simply went quiet. No distress calls, no mayday signals, no signs of battle. Just silence. Entire colonies vanished from the VoxNet as if erased from existence. A mining world of 3 million souls stopped responding. A research station orbiting a dying star sent one final message describing a shadow that eats thought, before falling silent forever. When reconnaissance vessels were dispatched, none returned. Imperial commanders argued. Some claimed it was a rebellion. Others suspected a new xenospecies. A few believed it was a warp storm forming, a rare but natural occurrence. But those theories collapsed when the Adeptus Mechanicus detected a pattern in the data. The dead outposts were not random. They formed a trail, a line, a direction. Something was moving, something vast. Across Segmentum Ultima, fear began spreading. Civilians whispered about ghosts in the void, about stars disappearing one by one. High-ranking officials debated sealing entire regions of space. But silence offers no answers, only dread. And dread had begun to spread faster than any fleet could fly. In Vigilus, in the crag, in the halls of Terra itself. The same question echoed. The Imperium had survived heresy, demons, and war without end. But nothing in living memory had made the galaxy this quiet, and it is in the quiet that predators hunt. The shadow in the warp did not arrive like a storm. Storms announce themselves. They roar, they thunder, they cast lightning across the heavens. This came like suffocation. A silent hand closing around the galaxy's throat. At first, navigators thought their instruments were malfunctioning. The warp currents they relied on, normally chaotic, but still readable, began to twist unnaturally. Their third eyes burned with pressure. Lines of probability dissolved into static. Ships attempted to make short jumps across safe corridors, only to emerge shredded, torn apart by unseen turbulence. And yet there was no warp storm on record. No demonic surge. No heretical ritual detected. It was simply darkness, a psychic pressure so heavy it crushed thought itself. The Astropaths were the first to feel the true horror. They sensed an ocean swelling in the void, rising higher with each passing hour. An ocean made not of water, but of hunger. Pure, insatiable, directionless hunger. Some astropaths clawed their own faces off, trying to stop the sensation. Others went mad in silence. A few managed to send warnings, but their final transmissions were incoherent, choked breaths, screams, and the sound of something wet and rhythmic beneath their words. Like a living heartbeat pressing against reality. Within days, entire star lanes went dark. Ships traveling through those regions described the same nightmare before all contact was lost. The Astronomicon, the holy light of Terra that guided mankind, flickered like a dying candle. Navigators strained, trembled, bled, and collapsed trying to glimpse it. Some tore their harnesses apart in blind panic. Others ripped out their own tongues. None could explain what they saw except in broken fragments. It is eating the light. There is something in the warp. It watches us, but not with eyes. Imperial Navy commanders panicked. Without the Astronomicon, fleets were blind. Trade halted. Reinforcements stalled. Some admirals suggested a full evacuation of the Eastern Fringe. Others refused, believing the darkness to be temporary. But as the shadow thickened, even experienced void soldiers felt unease worming into their souls. On some ships, the Geller fields flickered for brief moments. Not enough for demons to breach, but enough to let the crew feel the cold breath of something vast sliding past their reality. Something that was not warp-born. Something alive. Planets within the dark zone fell into chaos. Communications died. Vox frequencies filled with static. Entire continents were cut off from the rest of the Imperium. Emergency beacons failed. Governors issued decrees for martial law. People huddled in temples praying to the Emperor for light. But the priests had no comfort to give, for even their faith-born visions were consumed by the same oppressive presence. Then the dreams began. Civilians, soldiers, governors, psychers, millions across dozens of worlds shared a single recurring nightmare. A sky of churning blackness filled with a swarm so massive it blotted out the stars. Countless wings, countless claws, countless mouths gnashing in unison. A choir of hunger echoing across the void. Some dreamers woke screaming. Others did not wake at all. Inquisitors attempted to investigate the psychic contagion, but even they were shaken. A captured psyker, trembling and covered in his own blood, whispered the same sentence over and over until his last breath. It's not a storm. It's a mind. The shadow in the warp deepened, swallowing entire sectors in silence. The Imperium, built on communication, order, and the Emperor's holy light, found itself stumbling through a blindness it had never known. No enemy fleet had appeared. No demands had been made. No heralds of invasion had spoken. Only the darkness grew thicker, heavier. Closer, something enormous was moving behind it, so vast its presence alone smothered the warp. Silenced souls and made entire worlds tremble, and still, no one knew what was coming, only that whatever it was. The first confirmed contact did not come from a battlefield. It came from a grave drifting in space. For weeks, Imperial commanders had fought to understand the spreading silence across the Eastern Fringe. Entire outposts vanished, Astropaths died mid-scream, and navigators refused to open their warp eyes. Yet no enemy had been seen. No shapes on auspex. No fleets on long-range scanners. Just silence. Then a lone ship appeared at the edge of the mists, an ancient Imperial patrol vessel, the Vindex Resolute. Gliding without power, its engines dead. Its lights extinguished. Its hull scarred by deep gouges that looked disturbingly organic. Recovery teams from a nearby naval station were dispatched to investigate. They expected a derelict wreck, victims of a warp accident or pirates. What they found was far worse. The Vindex carried a crew of 300. Only one was still alive. A single man, barely conscious, leaning against the bulkhead of the primary hangar. His armor was shattered, his helmet split in two, and dried blood clung to every inch of him. When Medicae teams approached, he didn't speak. He only stared, eyes wide and empty, as if part of him had been carved away by something he couldn't comprehend. When they attempted to move him, he screamed. Not in pain, but in memory. It came from everywhere, he gasped. Not ships. Not anything we've seen. The void, it crawled. It breathed. He convulsed violently and had to be restrained. His pulse erratic, his mind broken, yet he kept whispering the same sentence, over and over, as if it had been burned into what remained of his sanity. We tried to fire. Emperor, help us. There was nothing to fire at. The Medicae assumed delirium. But the ship's interior told a different story. Every hallway was scarred as though melted. Metal bulkheads were pitted, twisted, or dissolved into strange patterns. Biological residue coated some walls viscous, pulsing, and still faintly warm, as if it had only recently lost life. Some crew members had clearly died fighting, their bodies torn apart by talons or drained of fluids entirely. Others seemed to have simply collapsed where they stood, no wounds, no injuries, just empty shells. The ship's data logs were corrupted, their machine spirits trembling from trauma. But the tech priests salvaged fragments, blurred images of something moving through the corridors, fast, sinuous, multi-limbed, and wrong. Too large to fit the passageways, yet it somehow moved through them as if its body reshaped from moment to moment. No one could tell how many there were. The footage showed flashes, claws slicing through armor like parchment, elongated skulls, rows of teeth glistening with iridescent fluid, tails that impaled bodies faster than the human eye could track. All blurred. All too fast. But the final recording, the one the survivor never spoke about, showed something worse. The ship's exterior cameras captured the Vindex emerging from the warp. The moment it dropped into real space, stars that should have been shining brightly appeared dim, muted like light seen through a thick fog. Then, shapes materialized behind the ship. Hundreds, thousands. At first glance, they looked like asteroids. But asteroids do not move in formation. They do not pulse. They do not open like mouths hungry for sustenance. These were living vessels, bioships the size of battleships. Their surfaces rippling with organic motion. Their hulls merging seamlessly with tendril-like protrusions that reached out into the void. They glowed faintly with bioluminescent veins, beating in rhythm like a colossal heart. Each ship emitted a psychic resonance that distorted the recording, warping the image with a nauseating pulse. And they surrounded the Vindex without a sound. The survivor had not escaped, because he fought. He escaped because he was ignored. The Hive Mind had consumed what it came for, the biomass of his crew. He was simply left behind. A scrap too low in nutritional value to bother with. When Imperial officials reviewed the recovered logs, silence filled the chamber. Cold, heavy, suffocating silence. They had been expecting raiders, Xenos pirates, maybe even a minor Hive fleet comparable to those previously encountered. But this was something else. This was a wall of living organisms stretching beyond scanner range. A fleet so large it defied classification. A swarm whose density blocked starlight. Whose presence crushed psychic connections. Whose hunger felt like a pressure on the soul. In the hours following the ship's recovery, more sightings came in. A listening post recorded a brief signal, a panicked transmission from a system in the Fringe. The voice was shaky, barely audible over static. They're not ships. They're not machines. They're alive. The whole void is alive. A final scream. Then static. Another message came from a mining station orbiting an unnamed world. The Vox relay carried 6 seconds of audio. Chaotic gunfire. People shouting orders, something metallic shattering. And beneath it all, a deep, wet, rumbling noise like the growl of a predator waking from hibernation. Then silence. By now, the Imperium's fear was turning into certainty. Whatever this enemy was, it was not small. It was not scattered. It was not probing. It was advancing methodically, deliberately, unstoppably. Fleet commanders requested emergency reinforcements. Astartes chapters demanded deployment orders. Inquisitors sent cryptic, urgent missives to Terra, yet every response was hindered by the same problem. The shadow in the warp made communication unreliable. Even when messages were sent, they arrived late, distorted, or not at all. Every fleet moved blind. Every order was delayed. Every scream was unheard. And through all this chaos, through all this fear, through all the fragments of horrors witnessed on broken vessels drifting back from the dark, one truth became undeniable. This was no isolated swarm. No splinter fleet. No remnant of previous encounters. This was the arrival of something colossal, something ancient, something relentless, the Hive fleet, and it was only the first wave. Imperium Command had little time to grieve over the horrors of the Eastern Fringe before the full weight of the Hive fleet's advance became apparent. Messages came in sporadically, broken and desperate, painting a picture of a galaxy already bending under the pressure of something far beyond comprehension. Worlds went dark. Communication arrays went silent. Even the Ecclesiarchy's psychers admitted that the Emperor's light seemed dimmer in the far reaches. The Imperium was facing not just an invasion, but a force that threatened to unravel the very fabric of its existence. High Lords of Terra convened urgently in the council chamber, a place of cold marble and echoing whispers, where centuries of decree and blood-worn treaties accumulated like dust. The discussion was frantic, yet polite, each voice attempting to hide terror beneath rigid formalities. Lords argued over the scale of mobilization, debated whether to divert naval assets from other sectors, and questioned the reliability of data streaming from the Fringe. Some demanded immediate purges of frontier systems, entire populations condemned to buy time. Others feared such action would be seen as panic, potentially weakening the morale of billions of loyal citizens. But all agreed on one thing: the Imperium had never faced a threat like this. While the Lords debated, the Imperium's military engines roared to life. Fleets that had been idle for decades were summoned to the Fringe. The Astra Militarum drilled the population for evacuation procedures, hastily constructing transport lines to remove civilians from threatened worlds. On industrial forge worlds, manufacturums ran at fever pitch, producing weapons, armor, and ammunition with relentless efficiency. Machine spirits screamed from the assembly lines as Mechanicus priests performed rites over iron and steel, attempting to sanctify what might soon be lost to the Hive fleet's hunger. Yet despite all efforts, the galaxy trembled with fear. Messages from governors, planetary governors, and sector commanders detailed panic in every port, every Hive city. Refugees flooded spaceports, fleeing worlds that were already screaming for help. And the civilians, though unaware of the Hive fleet's true nature, sensed something unnatural, something incomprehensible. Mothers clutched children in silent desperation. Priests cried for guidance. Merchants abandoned goods to flee. Even seasoned soldiers whispered of nightmares that had begun to stalk their minds during moments of rest, vast wings blotting out suns, claws tearing cities as if made of paper, teeth gnashing in the void. All of it feeding from some unstoppable will. And then came the Space Marines. Chapters across the Imperium were recalled from their duties-long campaigns, pilgrimage, even forbidden explorations of unknown worlds, and ordered to the Fringe. Drop pods rained from orbit like meteors, landing on devastated outposts and stripped planets, bringing with them the elite warriors of humanity. Each chapter carried centuries of tradition, rituals of battle, and weapons capable of tearing through the fabric of reality itself. But even these superhuman defenders faced unease. They had fought orcs, chaos, Tyranids in smaller numbers, but never a fleet so vast that it seemed to consume space itself. The first deployments were chaotic yet heroic. Astartes chapters like the Ultramarines, Salamanders, and Raven Guard moved swiftly to stabilize worlds. The drop pods penetrated the stratosphere, landing squads in the center of besieged cities, often facing hordes of unknown creatures before planetary defense lines could even report positions. For the civilians, the sight of a space marine descending from orbit in full power armor, weapons blazing, was both awe-inspiring and terrifying, a reminder that while the Imperium had defenders, the threat was beyond anything they had imagined. Even so, the Hive fleet adapted faster than the Imperium could respond. Entire worlds fell before reinforcements could arrive. Adaptive bioforms emerged that anticipated Imperial strategies. Trenches filled with spores erupted into living monsters. Supply lines were severed before they could be secured. Fleets dispatched to engage the swarm were met with bioluminescent leviathans whose sheer mass warped sensor readings and crushed void shields with bone-crunching precision. Every victory was Pyrrhic, every defense temporary. The Imperium was learning a terrifying lesson. Speed, numbers, and discipline were meaningless against a predator that evolved with each encounter. Amidst the chaos, human emotion became a weapon and a burden. Commanders wept quietly in their quarters over the lives they could not save. Soldiers prayed to the Emperor with desperation, begging for guidance and courage. Civilians huddled in underground sanctuaries, listening to the distant roar of wings and the impact of biomatter on city walls, unsure whether they were hearing artillery fire or the sound of the galaxy itself being consumed. The Imperium's soldiers, from the newest conscripts to the veteran Astartes, carried grief and terror in their hearts as much as they carried weapons. Every decision weighed heavy. Order an evacuation and risk chaos, hold the line and risk annihilation, or strike a desperate blow that might doom an entire sector. In the midst of all this preparation, whispers began spreading of worlds being entirely stripped of life. Reports came of planets reduced to husks, where the ground itself seemed to pulse with organic remnants. The Hive fleet's advance was not merely tactical, it was ritualistic. Each consumed world fed into the greater biomass, adding strength, intelligence, and strategy to the swarm. It was a force that was growing as it moved, a predator that became deadlier with every meal. By the time the Imperium fully grasped the scope, the first true battles erupted. Cities burned. Spaceports were overrun. Drop pods smashed into Hive complexes only to find alien bioforms waiting inside. The citizens witnessed legends of space marines confronting monsters so vast, so numerous, that entire companies vanished without trace, their sacrifice barely slowing the advance. The horror of these engagements was multiplied by the sheer size of the Hive fleet. No matter how many warriors fell, the swarm replenished, adapted, and continued its relentless push toward the core. High lords and strategists now faced an impossible choice: attempt a counteroffensive with the forces available or prepare for the inevitable. The Imperium's bureaucracy strained under the pressure of fear, logistics, and despair. Desperate measures were authorized: planetary bombardments, sanctioned executions of infected populations, even forbidden psychic rituals intended to delay the advance. But all of these actions were temporary bandages on a wound that was only growing larger, deeper, hungrier. And yet, amidst the panic, the Space Marines stood unwavering. Chapter Masters gave their men their final blessings, knowing that the coming battles would demand not just skill, but sacrifice. Librarians focused their minds to the warp, hoping to sense the Hive Mind's movements. Apothecaries readied themselves for casualties beyond count. And even in the shadow of annihilation, the Astartes carried with them the one thing the Hive fleet could not consume: humanity's unbreakable will to endure. A flame burning against the devouring darkness, the Imperium mobilized. The civilians fled. The fleets massed. The drop pods dropped. And somewhere, in the distance beyond the reach of sensors and comprehension, the Hive fleet advanced, vast, hungry, unstoppable. The galaxy was bracing for a conflict unlike any it had ever known. And in the hearts of men, in the whispers of terrified commanders and praying citizens, one question echoed: could humanity survive the swarm that had come for it? Or was the galaxy about to learn the true meaning of devouring horror? The world of Vraxis Prime had once been a jewel of the Eastern Fringe. Its towering hive cities scraped the heavens, powered by industrial furnaces and endless mechanized factories. It had survived border raids, piracy, and even minor Tyranid incursions decades ago, but nothing had prepared its citizens or defenders for the true horror now descending from the void. The Hive fleet had arrived. The first signs were subtle: minor disturbances in orbital scans, sudden shifts in gravitational anomalies, strange bursts of radiation, and unexplained failures of the planetary defense network. Civilian communications were filled with whispers of shadows moving across the starlit skies, colossal shapes glimpsed briefly between the clouds, and an unnatural silence that preceded every strike. By the time the Imperial Navy confirmed the Hive fleet's presence, panic had already gripped the population. Orders for evacuation went out, but chaos quickly overtook them. The swarm did not wait. It did not negotiate. It came to devour. Space Marines arrived in the first drop pods like falling meteors, landing in the heart of the Hive cities. The Ultramarines chapter led the vanguard, their power armor gleaming even as the skies above glowed with the bioluminescent light of approaching Tyranid bioships. Each pod hit like a hammer strike, crushing streets beneath molten metal impact, scattering terrified citizens, and immediately opening corridors of war amidst the chaos. The Space Marines deployed rapidly, their bolters spitting death with the precision and discipline only genetically enhanced warriors could maintain. The Tyranid forces responded almost instantaneously. Lictors, the stalking predators of the Hive, emerged from the shadows of the city's lower levels. They moved with horrifying grace, climbing walls, bursting through corridors, and striking before any warning could be sounded. Their claws shredded ceramite, their talons impaled Astartes as easily as if they were mere recruits. Bioforms the size of tanks lumbered across streets, crushing everything beneath them, their carapaces glistening whitely with a substance that burned through metal and flesh alike. The citizens of Vraxis Prime were caught between two horrors. Above them, the sky was a tapestry of alien forms, living ships, each thrumming with a heartbeat that seemed to echo in the bones of every human below. Every strike of the swarms, tendrils against the city, sent buildings collapsing in clouds of dust and fire. Civilians screamed in panic, clutching children, trying to reach evacuation transports that had already been torn from the landing pads or consumed in the carnage. Every moment stretched. Every breath became a prayer. Every glance risked a glimpse of something that should not exist. Space Marines fought tirelessly, moving from sector to sector, securing streets, clearing Hive spires, and attempting to establish defensive perimeters. Drop pod after drop pod fell, and squads fought with the unwavering discipline and focus only the Adeptus Astartes could maintain. Each squad carried not only bolters and power swords, but the weight of humanity's survival on their shoulders. Librarians attempted psychic pushes to disrupt the Hive Mind's coordination, but even their powers were tested against a consciousness that spanned light years and fed on strategy as much as flesh. Despite their efforts, the Hive fleet adapted rapidly. Bioforms evolved in response to weapons, changing size, shape, and even tactics in moments. Heavy tanks were neutralized by massive creatures with acid-dripping carapaces. Defensive lines were breached by swarms of gaunts moving faster than any human eye could track. And worse, the swarm seemed to anticipate every maneuver the Imperium attempted. It was as if Vraxis Prime were already dead before the first creature landed on its surface. Within the Hive city, civilians bore witness to unspeakable horrors. Parents screamed as their children were taken. Buildings collapsed upon the fleeing, and alleys became hunting grounds. Some tried to hide in the lower levels, only to encounter Tyranid bioforms that had tunneled unseen. The air was thick with the stench of burning flesh, ozone from bolter fire, and the wet, acidic tang of Tyranid blood. Medics ran frantically, trying to save the wounded, but every corridor seemed to stretch into an endless nightmare of death. Even the Astartes were not immune to the psychological terror. The sheer scale of the swarm, its ever-changing forms, the cries of dying civilians, and the whispers of the hive mind felt like a weight pressing against the mind itself. Chaplains led squads in prayers and liturgies, their voices defiant even as bolters roared and creatures fell screaming. Apothecaries tended to the fallen, recovering gene seed in conditions that would have broken ordinary humans, while sergeants shouted orders over the din of destruction. Every action was calculated, precise, and yet tinged with desperation. In the orbital space above Vraxis Prime, Imperial Navy vessels engaged the Hive Fleet's living ships. Their macro cannons roared, lances fired. Torpedoes streaked through the void. Yet the Tyranid vessels seemed to anticipate every attack, shifting, morphing, and absorbing damage in ways that confounded tactics manuals. Entire squadrons were consumed in seconds, leaving the ground forces below with the illusion that salvation had been lost before the battle truly began. By the end of the first cycle of combat, the city had been reduced to jagged ruins. Streets were impassable, rivers of molten debris ran through the city, and the cries of survivors echoed in the skeletal remains of once proud spires. Yet the Space Marines held positions at key junctions, every squad aware that if even a single sector fell, the hive mind would advance unchecked to the next. In the midst of despair, heroism persisted. A squad of ultramarines holding a collapsed plaza, a librarian blocking a swarm's advance with a psychic blast, a chaplain shouting prayers while cutting down monstrous forms with a Crozius Arcanum, even as his brothers fell around him. Despite the apparent victory in some sectors, the Hive Fleet's relentless advance continued. Reinforcements from nearby worlds were delayed or destroyed. Civilians were still being consumed, and the psychic pressure of the hive mind seemed to thrum through the ruins. The Imperium realized, even in this first engagement, that Vraxis Prime's fate might serve only as a temporary delay for the swarm's inexorable hunger, and so the battle raged, both on the streets and in the minds of those who survived. The Hive Fleet was adaptive, intelligent, unrelenting, endlessly hungry. The Imperium had defenders of superhuman skill and courage, but even the might of the Space Marines could not fully shield humanity from the terror that had arrived from the void. It was only the beginning. The shadow of the Hive Fleet stretched across the stars, and the galaxy had yet to see its true hunger. The sector was falling. The Imperium's planners had known it in their hearts before the first true battle, but knowing and seeing were entirely different experiences. Reports streamed in from every corner of the Eastern Fringe planets, stripped bare, fleets shredded in orbit, colonies rendered uninhabitable by the organic tide that advanced with perfect, horrifying efficiency. Each world lost fed the hive mind, each death added to its knowledge, each scream carried across light years as if a signal of victory. Humanity was bleeding, and the galaxy itself seemed to groan under the weight of its wounds. Vraxis Prime had not been the last. Other planets, desperate outposts in the sector, were succumbing with terrifying speed. Communications were fragmentary, Vox signals filled with panic and despair, and Astropaths attempting to coordinate evacuation were dropping dead mid-message. The Hive Fleet had learned the Imperium's tactics faster than the command structure could react. Fortresses thought impregnable were ripped apart in hours, supply lines intercepted and consumed, and civilian populations trapped in the chaos. The Imperium realized that no matter how many troops they sent, no matter how many drop pods fell, the swarm was always one step ahead. Space Marines were everywhere, and yet even they could not stem the tide. Chapters that had fought countless wars, veterans of countless campaigns, faced creatures unlike anything recorded in Imperial history. Bio-Titans shattered battle tanks with a single strike. Gaunts swarmed in numbers that made entire regiments of guardsmen disappear in moments. Lictors moved unseen, striking from shadows that should not exist, leaving squads decimated before the enemy was even visible. And worse, the swarm adapted to every tactic, every formation, every trap the Imperium devised. Amidst the chaos, the human cost became staggering. Civilians fled wherever they could, but evacuation corridors were clogged with the dead and dying. Parents abandoned children in terror, only to have those children dragged into the swarm's countless maws. Entire hive cities became hunting grounds, the streets slick with blood and acidic residue. Fires turned night into a hellscape of smoke and molten debris, the air thick with despair and ash. Medics, barely able to keep pace, worked tirelessly, but no triage could keep up with the carnage. Bodies were left where they fell, sometimes consumed entirely before burial rites could be performed. The psychological toll on the soldiers was equally severe. Guardsmen, trained for war, faltered in the presence of the Hive Mind's relentless advance. They saw the adaptive nature of the Tyranids firsthand, learned that no barricade was permanent, no reinforcement reliable, no strategy guaranteed to succeed. Fear spread faster than bullets or bolter fire. Even the Space Marines, paragons of stoicism, were not immune. They carried the grief of the countless lives they could not save, the horror of witnessing humanity being consumed, and the knowledge that the Hive Mind's intelligence grew with each victory. Chaplains led prayers to sustain morale, their voices ringing across ruined plazas. But even these sacred rituals were shadowed by the inevitability of death. Entire planetary sectors were lost almost simultaneously. Fortress worlds that had withstood invasions for millennia fell in hours. Orbital stations exploded in firestorms as Tyranid bioships tore through void shields with ease. Reports from surviving commanders were brief, filled with words of despair. All lines collapsed, evacuation impossible. Too many dead. They learned faster than we can fight. And in every report, the underlying terror remained constant. The Hive Mind was not just an enemy, it was a predator. Calculating, evolving, and unstoppable. Yet even in the darkness, glimmers of heroism persisted. Space Marines made desperate stands on doomed worlds, buying precious hours for evacuation. Ultramarines held a collapsed plaza, sacrificing their numbers to allow civilians to escape. Salamanders faced a bio-titan in a volcanic city, burning alive beneath its crushing weight to ensure their squad could survive. Raven Guard infiltrated Tyranid nests, assassinating synapse creatures to slow the swarm's coordination. Each act of courage came at a cost measured in lives, and yet these acts became the only light in a galaxy consumed by horror. The Imperium's High Lords, watching the sector fall in real time through fragmented reports, faced a choice between action and despair. Strategic fleets were redirected, planetary defenses reinforced, and entire chapters summoned to fight what remained. Desperation led to morally dubious decisions. Evacuation ships loaded with civilians were left behind to delay the swarm. Entire military units were sacrificed as bait, and planetary bombardments were authorized to prevent Hive fleet expansion sometimes, obliterating what remained of the populations they aimed to save. Each decision weighed heavily on the commanders, their minds haunted by the screams of the dead and the relentless advance of the swarm that seemed unstoppable. On the surviving worlds, the civilian suffering was immense. Families hidden ruined. Complexes listening to the distant roar of monstrous bioforms and the screams of neighbors being devoured. The smell of blood, fire, and acid filled the air. Despair became the constant companion of the living, while rumors of the Hive Mind's adaptability spread like wildfire. Survivors spoke in hushed tones of creatures that learned from death, that anticipated every defense, that seemed to consume not just flesh but knowledge itself. In these moments, even the bravest felt the weight of the Imperium's fragility. By the end of the first campaign across the sector, the statistics were horrifying. Millions of humans dead or missing, entire planets lost. Chapters of Space Marines diminished to skeletal remnants. Supply lines obliterated, strategic positions decimated. And still, the Hive fleet advanced, ever hungry, ever calculating. The Imperium understood one truth above all. The fight was no longer about winning battles. It was about survival. Every act of heroism, every strategic victory, every sacrifice bought time, nothing more. Humanity was on the brink, clinging to the edges of hope while the Hive Mind, vast and insatiable, reshaped the sector into a graveyard. And in the midst of despair, in the hearts of the Space Marines and the few surviving civilians, a defiance burned. The Imperium would fight. The Emperors will demanded it. And though the galaxy might fall, though worlds might burn and millions perish, the flame of humanity, fragile as it was, would endure. But even this defiance carried terror. How much longer could it endure against a foe that evolved faster than any defenses, that consumed everything in its path, and that seemed to learn from every strike, every death, every cry? The answer was unknown, and the galaxy trembled beneath the shadow of the Hive fleet.
The air over the shattered world of Talgareth was thick with smoke and the acrid tang of burning flesh. The skies glowed with the eerie luminescence of the Hive fleet, its bioships pulsing like colossal hearts in orbit, their shadows falling across ruined spires and the cratered streets below. Every surface was alive with movement, skittering Tyranid gaunts, towering monstrous bioforms, and the silent predatory glide of lictors, stalking corridors and alleyways like shadows made flesh. The Imperium had brought its best, the combined might of multiple chapters, but even the Space Marines, paragons of human perfection, felt the weight of despair pressing upon them. The Ultramarines chapter led the vanguard, deploying in perfect formation across the ruined city. Bolters spat death in rhythmic bursts, chainswords roared through armored hides, and librarians unleashed psychic volleys to disrupt the Hive Mind's coordination. Yet for every Tyranid that fell, two more took its place. Every bioform destroyed seemed to adapt, its successors faster, more cunning, hungrier. The enemy was not just an army, it was evolution incarnate. A predator that learned from every encounter, whose hunger was infinite. The chaplains moved among the squads like grim beacons of faith, their Crozius arcanum striking down monstrous forms, even as they lifted the morale of the Marines with prayers to the Emperor. Each recitation echoed across shattered plazas, attempting to infuse courage into brothers who had seen the dead rise again, the civilians devoured, and entire sectors reduced to ash. Apothecaries followed, collecting gene seed from fallen brothers, their hands steady even as the screams of battle filled every corner. Every loss was personal, every casualty a reminder that the enemy was relentless. Amidst the chaos, acts of heroism shone like sparks against the void. Sergeant Kale of the Raven Guard led a daring strike into the heart of a Tyranid nest, eliminating a synapse creature controlling hundreds of gaunts. The squad fought tooth and nail, every bolt and sword swing precise, measured, and lethal. By the time the creature fell, the squad had been reduced to half strength, and Kale himself was grievously wounded. Yet he remained upright, refusing to yield, even as the swarm pressed harder. Elsewhere, a Salamander's squad held a collapsing industrial district, their flammers and meltabombs reducing the monstrous bioforms to ash and smoke. Civilians trapped in the ruins were evacuated by the squad, carried through debris and fire, while the Marines held the line. Brothers fell around them, torn apart by claws, acid, and monstrous jaws. Yet not a step backward was taken. Each life saved was bought with their own, each second a precious reprieve for the fleeing innocents. The librarians faced a psychological war as much as a physical one. The Hive Mind's psychic presence was immense, a crushing wave that sought to bend thought and warp perception. Their minds pushed against the pressure, every psychic blast a blade against an invisible foe. Some faltered, succumbing to terror or madness. Others, their eyes glowing with warp light, became conduits of vengeance, directing their powers with precision to disrupt Tyranid coordination, buying critical moments for their brethren and civilians alike. Even the custodes had been deployed, silent and immovable as statues, their glaives cutting through monstrous forms with unerring precision. Yet they were few, and the Hive Fleet's tendrils were countless. Entire avenues of approach were blocked, the streets clogged with biomass, acid, and the dead. The scale of the Hive Mind's hunger was staggering, an intelligence that seemed to anticipate every defensive measure, every formation, every strike of the Emperor's finest warriors. In the midst of this despair, moments of humanity emerged. A young Imperial guardsman, separated from his regiment, shielded a child from a falling spire, bolter fire cutting down gaunts before they could reach him. A chaplain, chanting the litanies of faith, shielded civilians with his body as monstrous claws tore through walls behind him. And a librarian, face pale and sweat-streaked, screamed into the void as he unleashed a psychic blast that shattered a massive bioform, knowing he would not survive the backlash. These moments were fleeting, fragile sparks against a backdrop of annihilation. Yet they reminded the galaxy why the Imperium fought, why humanity clung to life even in the face of the impossible. The final hours of the battle were a symphony of horror and valor. Streets became rivers of acid and fire. Buildings collapsed under their own weight or the crushing presence of monstrous Tyranids. Civilians screamed, their cries merging with the roars of the predators, the fire of bolters, and the shrill chants of chaplains. Every corner turned held the potential for death, yet Space Marines pressed forward, unyielding, unbroken, carrying the weight of humanity on their shoulders. As the Hive Mind adapted further, new forms emerged, creatures with thickened carapaces, claws longer than a man's height, and gaping maws lined with teeth that shattered ceramite. Entire squads were wiped out in seconds, the psychic shriek of the Hive Mind filling the minds of survivors, threatening to shatter resolve. Yet still the Space Marines held. Each loss was answered with greater courage. Each fallen brother a reminder that retreat was not an option. By the battle's end, the defenders of Talgareth were reduced to scattered remnants. Streets were impassable, survivors huddled in ruins, and the sky was a tapestry of the Hive Fleet's glowing tendrils. Yet even in this devastation, a single truth remained. The Space Marines had bought time. Civilian evacuation had been partially successful. The Hive Mind had been slowed, and the Imperium's presence endured, however fragile. But the cost was catastrophic. Entire chapters were decimated, squads erased from existence, and even the strongest warriors bore the psychic scars of witnessing what no human mind was meant to endure. The Hive Fleet had learned, adapted, and grown stronger from every encounter. Humanity had survived this battle, but the war was far from over. The shadows of the Hive Fleet stretched across the stars, and every light in the galaxy was now under threat of being consumed. Amid the ruins, the last surviving Marines gathered. Chaplains recited prayers, librarians whispered to the warp for strength, and apothecaries prepared for the long march ahead. The sacrifice of the fallen had bought time, but only time. And in that time, the Hive Mind continued its advance, relentless, intelligent, and hungry for the galaxy itself. The Space Marines, weary, bloodied, and scarred, looked to the horizon, knowing the next battle was coming. And in that moment, they understood the truth of the Imperium's fight. It was not enough to defend, not enough to survive. Humanity's fate depended on unyielding courage, and even the strongest hearts must burn brighter than the devouring darkness if the galaxy was to see another dawn.
The hive mind was learning, not slowly, not hesitantly, but with a terrifying, deliberate precision that left the Imperium reeling. Every encounter with the Imperium's forces, every planetary defense, every drop pod, every bolter shot, every psychic push, it was absorbed, analyzed, and incorporated into the endless cognition of the Tyranid swarm. From the smallest gaunt to the colossal bio-titans that tore through orbital defenses, each organism became both weapon and teacher, a living extension of a mind that stretched beyond comprehension. In the orbital voids above shattered worlds, Imperial sensor arrays flickered with anomalies. Ships dispatched to intercept the Hive fleet reported disturbing developments. Bioships splitting and recombining mid-flight, shells hardening against previously lethal ordnance, and strange organic weapons sprouting along hulls that had once been impervious. The Tyranids were no longer just attacking, they were evolving in real time. What had begun as predictable patterns now became a fluid, shifting nightmare. Their attacks were no longer linear, but layered, simultaneous, and adaptive. Each planet became a testing ground, each battle a crucible refining the swarm's deadly efficiency. On worlds already scarred by war, the first signs of evolution were visible in horrifying detail. Gaunts, once fast but fragile, now moved with unnatural coordination, forming moving walls of biomass that resisted bolter fire. Warriors developed secondary limbs, claws capable of piercing even the heaviest ceramite armor, and carapaces that absorbed plasma and laser cannon blasts. Lictors, already masters of stealth, became impossible to detect, their flesh almost imperceptible against shadowed walls, now moving with uncanny foresight, anticipating ambushes before the Space Marines could react. Synapse creatures increased in size and intelligence, their psychic presence so potent that even experienced librarians felt their minds bending under pressure. The Hive Mind's evolution was not limited to combat effectiveness. It began shaping entire ecosystems on the planets it consumed. Forests and jungles grew into organic fortresses, vines and tendrils pulsating with energy and feeding biomass back to the swarm. Rivers turned acidic, skies thickened with spores, and cities that had been spared by initial bombardment were twisted into living nests, their walls breathing and mutating with every attack. Civilians trapped in these environments were rarely seen again, their screams absorbed into the living architecture of the Tyranid hive spawn. Across the sector, Imperial commanders realized the terrifying truth. The hive mind was not merely adaptive, it was strategic. Each planet lost was a lesson, each victory an experiment. Even entire chapters of Space Marines had become part of its curriculum. Weapons that had destroyed thousands of Tyranids were now ineffective against the same forms a week later. The swarm anticipated, countered, and evolved with horrifying speed. In the eyes of the Imperium, the very laws of warfare seemed meaningless.
Psychic shockwaves from the hive mind were reaching further than ever. Adeptus Astra Telepathica reported unusual strain on warp channels. Astropaths, tasked with long-range communication, experienced unprecedented psychic feedback, some dropping dead mid-sentence, others screaming incoherently of devouring darkness. The hive mind's psychic tendrils began to touch even distant sectors, hinting at a reach that defied the speed of light, as if consciousness itself could traverse the void instantly. The Imperium's nerves were fraying, and even the Emperor's light seemed dimmer in the regions under observation. In response, Space Marines adapted, but even their ingenuity struggled against a foe that learned as fast as they acted. Librarians pushed their psychic powers to extremes, attempting to disrupt synapse links and sever the hive mind's control over swarms. Yet every spell cast was studied, analyzed, and countered by the Tyranids within hours. Tactical innovation, once the cornerstone of Astartes' supremacy, became a race against a predator that evolved faster than the soldiers could strategize. The civilians bore witness to an escalating nightmare. Survivors of earlier invasions reported that the creatures themselves seemed to change shape before their eyes. Gaunts grew longer limbs, claws split into multiple appendages, and spines became barbed weapons. Swarms that had once moved like rivers of insects now surged like predatory tides, forming massive, coordinated assaults that swallowed entire city blocks. Children whispered in terror of the things that learned too fast, while the old spoke of omens, of the universe itself turning against them. High lords on Terra were acutely aware of the implications. They convened emergency councils, reviewing reports of the Hive Fleet's growth with growing dread. Strategists argued, debated, and proposed solutions, but even their most radical plans were undermined by the swarm's adaptability. Any attempt to trap, destroy, or corral it failed. The hive mind's intelligence, fed by countless consumer worlds and battles, proved infinitely more cunning than the rigid bureaucracies of the Imperium could anticipate. In orbit and on the ground, the Imperium braced for an escalation unlike any it had seen. Space Marines readied themselves for the coming battles, fully aware that every strike might be met with new horrors, new bioforms, and new methods of destruction. Every fortress would be tested beyond its design, every strategy challenged, and every life risked. And yet, within the horror, a grim determination persisted. Humanity would resist, the Emperor demanded it, the hive mind would be confronted. Every second of survival, every act of defiance, every life preserved mattered in the battle against the all-consuming swarm. Across the stars, the hive mind pulsed like a vast organic brain, processing, learning, evolving. The galaxy itself seemed to hold its breath, awaiting the next movement of a predator that had grown beyond measure, beyond comprehension, beyond mercy. And as Space Marines prepared, fleets assembled, and the Imperium braced for the unthinkable, a single terrifying truth became undeniable. The hive mind had only just begun. The swarm would continue to evolve, to learn, to consume, and the galaxy had no precedent for what might come next. In the shadows of the Imperium, in the minds of its bravest warriors, and across the ruins of countless worlds, one word echoed, whispered in fear and awe alike. The hive mind was perfect, and perfection, unopposed, would devour everything.
Terra, the heart of the Imperium, had always been a place of unwavering authority, its spires and citadels a testament to millennia of human triumph. Yet now the very core of humanity trembled. Reports of the Hive Fleet's advance filtered in sporadically, fragmented and horrifying. The news was inescapable. Entire sectors were lost, millions of lives consumed, and the hive mind had adapted beyond anything the Imperium had ever faced. On Terra, this realization struck with a weight heavier than any void storm, a psychic pressure that seeped into the marble corridors of the High Lord's chambers and into the hearts of every citizen. Panic began to ripple through the hive cities of Terra. Civilians had long been indoctrinated with faith and duty, yet even they could not ignore the fear gnawing at their minds. Rumors of worlds erased from existence, fleets swallowed whole, and monstrous creatures that could anticipate human tactics. The common people whispered of the hive mind as if it were a god of destruction, its reach infinite, its hunger eternal. Markets emptied. Streets flooded with refugees from outlying sectors, and temples overflowed with desperate prayers.
Yet the ecclesiarchy could offer little comfort. The psychic resonance of the swarm reached Terra's upper wards, dampening the glow of the Emperor's light and twisting visions of salvation into nightmares of annihilation. Within the corridors of power, the High Lords convened in unprecedented sessions. Councils stretched through nights without rest, with advisors, generals, and inquisitors debating strategy in voices strained with tension. Imperial fleets were recalled, Space Marine chapters redirected, and planetary defenses reinforced at a pace faster than even the Mechanicus had ever attempted. Orders were executed with precision, yet the swarm's adaptability rendered many plans almost immediately obsolete. Every strategy became a test of endurance against an enemy that not only attacked, but evolved with each encounter. Space Marines prepared with grim determination. Drop pods and strike cruisers were readied, chaplains led litanies of faith, and librarians focused their psychic might in preparation for assaults that would push them to the very edge of sanity. Every chapter received intelligence of the Hive Mind's latest mutations. Gaunts with reinforced carapaces impervious to standard bolters, monstrous bioforms that could anticipate flank maneuvers, and synapse creatures whose psychic links extended farther than ever before. The threat was no longer confined to the Eastern Fringe. Its reach threatened the Imperium's very core.
On the streets, the psychological toll on Terra's citizens became palpable. Civilians huddled in shadowed alleys, listening to news broadcasts of entire star systems consumed. Children asked their parents if the Hive fleet could reach Terra. Priests tried to maintain calm, yet the psychic echo of the Hive Mind turned prayer into fear, leaving even the faithful trembling. Hospitals overflowed, not with wounds from battle, but with panic-induced heart attacks, strokes, and hysteria. Every night, citizens reported dreams filled with monstrous forms blotting out suns, clawed hands tearing cities apart, and alien eyes staring from the darkness. Sleep became a fleeting refuge, fear the constant companion of the living. Amidst this fear, the Imperium's defenses became a hive of controlled chaos. Manufactoriums ran at maximum output, producing weapons, ammunition, and fortified armor. Adeptus Mechanicus priests performed rites over every piece of equipment, imbuing it with the Emperor's blessings and ensuring the machine's spirits were prepared for the unimaginable. Fleet captains coordinated orbital defenses, monitoring for any sign of the Hive fleet's approach. Every drop pod, torpedo, and battlecruiser carried the weight of hope, yet none could guarantee survival against an enemy that evolved faster than any human mind could anticipate. The psychological horror extended to Terra's warriors. Even the most seasoned Astartes felt the pressure. Chapters arrived in orbit, aware that each engagement would not just be a battle, but a test of endurance, adaptation, and sacrifice. The librarians studied reports of the Hive Mind's psychic reach, their minds pushed to extremes as they attempted to anticipate the swarm's strategies. Chaplains led their brethren in prayers of resilience, their voices cutting through the anxiety that threatened to erode morale. Each warrior understood that Terra itself might become a battlefield, that every citizen, every building, every street could be the stage for the next engagement against a predator that knew no mercy. Evacuation plans were drafted for the most vulnerable sectors, yet there was no guarantee they would succeed. Transports were prepared, but fleets that should have escorted them were already committed to reinforcing frontier systems. The citizens of Terra were reminded that even the mightiest defenses were not impregnable, and fear became a constant companion as families waited,
prayed, and hoped for salvation that might never arrive. The High Lords also turned to the shadowed corridors of the Inquisition. Agents of the Ordo Xenos scoured intelligence reports, seeking any insight into the Hive Mind's intentions, origins, and weaknesses. Inquisitors whispered of the swarm as a force beyond comprehension, a predator that could anticipate human thought and strategy. Reports of Hive Fleet evolution, synapse manipulation, and psychic resonance were catalogued and debated. But even their combined knowledge could only provide limited clarity. The enemy was too vast, too intelligent, too relentless. Amidst this fear, the Imperium's defenses became a hive of controlled chaos. Manufactoriums ran at maximum output, producing weapons, ammunition, and fortified armor. Adeptus Mechanicus priests performed rites over every piece of equipment, imbuing it with the Emperor's blessings and ensuring the machine spirits were prepared for the unimaginable. Fleet captains coordinated orbital defenses, monitoring for any sign of the Hive Fleet's approach. Every drop pod, torpedo, and battlecruiser carried the weight of hope, yet none could guarantee survival against an enemy that evolved faster than any human mind could anticipate. This was the Imperium, the guardians of humanity. Their warriors stood, ready to face the approaching darkness, with steel in their hands and faith in their hearts. And so, as the Hive Fleet advanced, its shadow stretching ever closer to Terra, the Imperium prepared. Space Marines readied their drop pods, fleets massed in orbit, and the High Lords coordinated defenses with a grim determination. The world's hive cities braced, their citizens huddled in fear and hope alike, while psychic wards and litanies attempted to hold back the mind of the swarm. The galaxy's heart was under threat, and the fight that would determine the fate of humanity was about to begin. The Hive Mind was out there, learning, adapting, evolving. And Terra, proud, eternal, indomitable Terra, would be its ultimate test. The Imperium's finest warriors prepared, their resolve unbroken, their hearts burning with faith, their weapons ready to strike. And in the shadows, the stars themselves seemed to hold their breath, awaiting the coming storm.
The void above Terra trembled with unnatural energy. Fleet screens flickered under psychic interference as reports streamed in from the Eastern Fringe and beyond. The Hive Fleet had arrived. Its colossal bioships blotted out the stars, living vessels pulsing with a heartbeat that seemed to echo in the minds of all who observed. The Emperor's light, ever bright across the Imperium, felt dimmer here, warped by the psychic resonance of the Hive Mind. Every sensor, every astropathic message, every warning screamed the same truth. This would be a battle unlike any the galaxy had ever faced. Space Marines deployed in relentless precision. Drop pods thundered through the skies, impact shaking cities and splintering streets. Chapters from across the Imperium, Ultramarines, Salamanders, Raven Guard, Blood Angels, and a dozen others descended like meteors, bolters roaring, power swords carving through the first waves of Tyranid bioforms. Each Astartes carried centuries of genetic perfection, battle-honed instincts, and a will forged in the crucible of uncountable wars. The heroism of the Space Marines escalated to legend. Librarians, their minds alight with warp energy, unleashed psychic volleys that disintegrated monstrous forms while risking total psychic collapse. Chaplains led last stands, defying overwhelming odds to hold critical junctions. Terminator squads teleported into Tyranid nests, annihilating synapse creatures and buying vital time, fully aware that the teleport might deposit them in a death trap from which they would not return. Each loss was monumental, each sacrifice etched into the annals of the Imperium, yet the battle continued.
As the Hive Mind intensified its assault, the strategic heart of Terra became a battlefield. Entire sectors were engulfed in darkness, communication networks flickered, and the psychic pressure threatened to unhinge the minds of the defenders. The Emperor's palace, normally unassailable, trembled under the psychic waves of the Hive Mind. Psychers stationed around the palace worked furiously, casting wards, shielding the city from psychic invasion, and attempting to sever the Hive Mind's influence. Yet, the Hive Mind adapted. Psychic feedback caused equipment to fail, psychers to collapse, and even space marines to stagger under the weight of alien mental intrusion. The climactic battle raged in a single uniformed crescendo. Bolter fire tore through swarms, meltabombs and flamers reduced bioforms to ash, and drop pods rained like meteors across hive spires. Entire chapters were tested to the limit, suffering casualties that would have decimated regular armies multiple times over. Yet they held. Each strike, each sacrifice, each bullet and blade was a defiance of annihilation. Chaplains screamed prayers while falling, librarians unleashed psychic energy until their bodies were broken, and sergeants rallied their remaining brothers with unyielding courage. In the final moments, the Hive Mind deployed its deadliest forms. Bio-Titans, massive beyond comprehension, clawed through city defenses. Gargantuan synapse creatures coordinated waves of gaunts with terrifying intelligence. Swarms that once numbered thousands now numbered millions, moving with a precision that outmatched any human command. Yet the Space Marines fought with unrelenting resolve, carving paths through the monstrosities, buying time for evacuation fleets and civilians to escape into orbit. Every second mattered, every life saved was a victory, even as death surged around them. By the end of the engagement, Terra was scarred, yet it stood. The Hive Mind had been slowed, its advance blunted by unimaginable sacrifice. Space Marine chapters were reduced to skeletal remnants, countless lives were lost, and entire sectors had been consumed or devastated. Civilians survived in part thanks to the courage of the Adeptus Astartes, yet the galaxy had seen the true horror of the Hive Mind's hunger. And though the battle was over, the war was far from finished. In the ruins, the last Space Marines regrouped. Chaplains prayed over the dead, librarians tended to the wounded and recalibrated psychic wards, and apothecaries collected the gene seed of fallen brothers. Every survivor understood the same truth. The Hive Mind had learned, adapted, and evolved further, and the Imperium would face it again. Each life preserved, each victory gained was a temporary reprieve in a war that would test the very limits of humanity. And somewhere in the void, beyond sensors and comprehension, the Hive Mind pulsed, ever hungry, ever calculating, its tendrils probing, analyzing, evolving. The galaxy had endured its first true encounter with a force beyond understanding, and the echo of that encounter would shape every campaign, every battle, and every desperate strategy to come. Humanity had survived, yet the shadow of the Hive Mind stretched across the stars, a reminder that even the mightiest defenders were but mortals standing against an infinite, devouring darkness. The Emperor's flame burned still, faint but unextinguished, and in that flame the Imperium's warriors found their resolve to fight, to endure, to sacrifice, and to hold back the devouring darkness for as long as fate allowed. The Hive Mind had tested them, and though victory had been Pyrrhic, hope, fragile, scarred, and desperate, remained.